19th episode in the ongoing series here on Svarim Chatter, Spanish Jewry Through the Ages. This episode will be the finale in the series, but I'm not calling it the finale in the title, although I've called it the finale here. It's still possible that I'll come back and tie up some loose ends and revisit it with a finale episode, so to speak, for episode 20. But for now, this is going to be the finale episode. And this episode discusses with someone who kind of descended from crypto Jews, Moranos, Conversos. We've used different words here. And it's a really fascinating story how she found herself and came back to Yiddishkeit. It's really, the book is really just really inspiring read and just an incredible story. There's also her companion historical fiction novel that she wrote that it really goes together with the book. I really enjoyed reading both, and I'm going to put both in links to both in the show's notes, and I really highly recommend it. It's not like a lot of the other books that I discuss on the podcast or recommend where they're academic and things like that and kind of like serious scholarship. It's not that. It's a really incredible story. It's a really great read, and I really highly recommend it to listeners. And so I think this kind of is kind of puts a bow on things, I guess, to finish it off the series. And of course, as I mentioned, there have been things that have been missed. I got an email, and I think this is accurate to some extent. Maybe things kind of lagged at parts in the series, a little bit loopy, a little too long in some ways. And I have gotten good feedback on the series, and thank you to those that have given me the feedback. And if you think it was a little too long and maybe it should have covered some things that it didn't, like Kabbalah or disputations or whatever, and it covered too much of other things, let me know. Email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com. And so after this, I expect there'll be a little bit of a break. Be just the Sunday episode, one a week, a break from a series. But then stay tuned. The next series on the podcast, The 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness, is ready to go. Just about ready. Well, it's ready to go. There's still one or two that I have to record, and that's going to be really a lot of fun. I recorded most of them, like I said, and it really fascinating stuff. But for now, enjoy this, the last episode in the series, Spanish Jewry Through the Ages. I would like to thank the corporate sponsor of the series, Gluck Plumbing, and really thank them for sponsoring the Shabtai Tzvi series and now this series here on the Spanish Jewry and going forward the series in the Lost Tribes. And so, if you live in Lakewood or New Jersey, you should use Gluck Plumbing and tell them they found them through the podcast. But it's really thanks to them that these series are really able to happen. And so, I'm appreciative, and I hope you are as well, that they sponsored this series and allowed me to do such an extensive series and deep dive into Shabtai Tzvi, now Spain, and then it's going to be the Lost Tribes, and ready working on the next one after that. So for all your service needs, big or small, in New Jersey, with a full service division, from boiler changeouts, main sewer line snakeouts, cameraing main lines, to a simple faucet leak, Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. Again, 732-523-1836, extension 1. And if you use them, which you should, tell them that you heard about them on Svarim Chatter. If you'd like to sponsor an episode on the podcast, you can do so via, there's a link via PayPal. You can Zelle, Chase QuickPay, svarimchatter@gmail.com, and that information is in the show's notes. If you want to give any amount less, you can do so as well. Then the same PayPal or Chase QuickPay, Zelle, or email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, if you want to do another way. I appreciate I've gotten from other people. I really appreciate that. And I hope you're enjoying the improved audio quality here. The episode itself was done before, via Zoom. Now I've kind of transitioned over to Riverside and a proper mic and different things. There's the intro music. There's going to be some different cover art coming out, and so various different things that I'm always looking to improve. So I'm taking suggestions, and also, if you want to support the podcast monetarily to help out with that or different things that could be improved upon, I do appreciate that. Also, if you can subscribe to the podcast 24/6, Spotify, Apple Music, etc. And also, if you listen on Apple and Spotify, you can rate, and on Apple, if you can review, very much appreciated. So, again, I might end up doing a one more to wrap things up. But otherwise, this is the finale episode. And sorry if I'm rambling a little bit. I just wanted to take this opportunity to, talk to listeners and really to thank you for listening to this series. And I hope you found it informative and interesting. And it was for me to record and to do the research and to get the guests and to talk about it. A lot does go into these series. A lot does go into the episodes. And so, I do hope that you're able to see that and you're able to really enjoy that and we're able to enjoy the episode. And so if you have any kind of comments or feedback on the series overall, I would appreciate that. There's also the WhatsApp chat if you're on it, the WhatsApp community. If not, you can email me for the link to the Farm Chat WhatsApp community and you can message me there. My number's there, or you can WhatsApp, or you can email me, farmchat@gmail.com, and any comments. And if you have anything that you would like to hear if you want to have another finale episode, or again, any suggestions for the Telling Those Tribes series or anything else, there's that. And with that, enjoy this final episode in the series Spanish Jewry Through the Ages. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Farm Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Genie Milgrom, who is an author and a crypto-Jewish researcher. And we'll be discussing her life story, which is quite fascinating. And it's she has kind of two books based around it. One book is really My 15 Grandmothers, and as well as a historical fiction novel that incorporates a lot of these elements from that titled Pyre to Fire. So thank you for joining me.
Hi, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here today and to be able to talk about my story and have people that are listening understand what it means to be an actual descendant of the Spanish Jews. 523 years later, it's important that people understand that, as Jews, we never really go away. Maybe we just take a hiatus. I will be talking about my childhood, my upbringing, how I came to where I am. It's a difficult story still for me to tell, even after I have been telling this story for over 20 some years. I've spoken at the Knesset about this. I've spoken at the EU Press Box Parliament. I've spoken at APAC for the first time about this topic, all in relation to how does the return of the crypto Jews affect, or how big is it? How big is the movement? How many people are returning? How will it affect the numbers of the Jewish people? And we will get back to that at the end, but I will tell you about my upbringing and how I got to where I am today. So I was born in Havana, Cuba, and to a very old Spanish family. My family had not been in Cuba for many generations. My grandparents had only come from Spain in 1923. So really, my mom was first generation and I was second generation. And I left at the age of 4 with the whole family, extended family, cousins. Everybody moved to Cuba a few months after Fidel Castro took over. My family were all business owners. My dad's side was in pharmaceuticals since the 1800s, and my mom's side, they were all in what we would fondly call in shmatas. They were always making socks. They were in haberdashery. They were just in what we would call typical Jewish, let's say, factories and this and that. They did have about 6 factories in Cuba, 1,500 employees. Everybody picked up their bags in 1960, and we all moved to Miami, where I have been since then. So it was the kind of upbringing. My family was Roman Catholic. I never saw them being super religious, but the fact that they were Roman Catholic, they put me in Catholic school immediately, like when I was 5. So this Catholic school upbringing in Miami was pretty strict. There's enough jokes about I survived Catholic school in the 60s to understand that this is pretty intense. So I started immediately. There's a lot of dogma taught in the Catholic school, even from a young age. I always had a hard time. I mean, I don't think that I'm a difficult person. I think that as it was being, and I'll use the word, maybe it's not the best word, but as it was being fed to me, I was like, no, this didn't happen like that. And it got me in trouble. It got me in trouble because I questioned it from the get-go. And it was nuns and it was priests and you know, they were, oh, you need to reflect. Why don't you learn Latin? They took away my recess. I had to learn Latin. I mean, it was really, and I didn't feel I could talk to mom and dad about it. I didn't even feel I could talk to my older sister, who's 4 years older. I didn't even feel, because it started so young that somehow it was weird, but I felt that I had been born, not that I had been born, I felt that I was in the wrong place. Sometimes even, and again, this is a very hard story for me to tell, because while it is my story, and while I do talk about it around the world, there's a lot of pain involved. There's pain as I was growing up. There's pain as I was going through, you know, and today it's just, you know, amazing. I'm probably the proudest Jew, you know, but it was very difficult. Mom and dad just, you know, part of the Catholic education is to go to mass every Sunday. And in this particular Catholic school, we had to go to mass every morning. So we went with the school and, you know, we were following everything. I mean, if we were to look at it through a Jewish lens, it was an ultra-Orthodox Catholic school. So that's just the way it was. The nuns had their convent right next to the school. The priests live in what is called a rectory that was like adjacent to the school. Huge school in Coral Gables in Miami. If you know Miami, you know that it's very beautiful. It's very from the 20s, the architecture, and this school was like that. So at one point, I started to question why my mom and dad would drop my sister and I off at the church on Sundays. We had to be there. You had to drop off your offering and money on Sundays. And if you didn't, it was taken off your religion grade. My sister and I were dropped off at noon. We were picked up at 1, and then we'd go have something to eat. Generally, at the time, you know, just the whole family. And nobody went to church with us. Meanwhile, in the church were all the big Cuban families, everybody hugging, everybody kissing. And my sister and I, like, you know, I was 5, 6, 7, and she was 4 years older. We're standing at the door of the church, kind of like, you know, timidly looking at each other like, why is nobody else here? But I never saw my parents put a foot in church. I never saw my maternal grandparents put a foot in church. It was just something that kind of took for granted. And for some reason, I don't understand why I couldn't ask. You know, I go back to this. And when I've asked my sister, who, by the way, is still Catholic and understands this ancestry and everything we'll talk about, has zero interest. And she said that she didn't ask because it wasn't important to her. And I didn't ask because I just didn't think I could. So the years passed, a couple of years into this, maybe I met my first Jewish child at a camp, and she was keeping kosher. I didn't understand at the time. She came with her food. She wouldn't even drink a juice or a Coke or anything. And we would arrive early, and she taught me so much about Judaism. I always mention her name. It was Rachel Friedman, because if I should ever, on all social media, I've never found Rachel Friedman again. I mean, maybe she's gone, but we sat for years in the morning, like from 7 to 8, and she would teach me. Obviously, I was learning the Old Testament, the Torah, but she taught me deeper, and she taught me about kashrut, and she taught me so much. And she put that seed in my head in a place where my heart was open to that. So the years passed. I went on to a Catholic high school, of course. In the beginning, it was all girls, pretty intense as well, but I always was very connected to God. And even though the surrounding dogma of the Catholic religion is something that I didn't connect with, I did connect with God. So I was a spiritual leader for most of my high school years. And then life continued, and I went on to Barry University, an all-girls Catholic university. And it kind of seems like, this was one long yeshiva run, but the reality is that, my parents kept sending me down that route. And, my friends by then had, moved on. They were in Boston University, and they were here and they were there. And I was still in Miami, once again with the nuns, and really struggling. I was in pre-med, and I was, it was all science and this and that. So in the electives, I took comparative religions. And it was one nun who later, she was the dean. She taught this comparative religion class. And I mean, we learned everything, Shinto, everything at the university level. But when she got to Judaism, oh my gosh, my heart flipped. And I said to her, it may have been inappropriate to the dean of a Catholic girls' university, but I said, I feel what I'm studying, I feel like I'm home. And she said, well, it is the basis of the Catholic religion. I said, yes, it's the basis, but this is my belief system. So I got married very young. I moved on. I got married at 18 to a Cuban Catholic man in the church. And I had 2 kids, and all of this continued in my head. Like I was in the wrong place. I was at the wrong time. And years passed. The time came to start putting my children into the Catholic, let's say, pipeline. And they were not in Catholic schools. I did not want to do that to them. But I also recognized that if I was having an existential crisis with this, it was not fair to how old were they? Maybe they're 10 years apart. So maybe my daughter was 3, maybe my son was 11. And I did run him through taking him to Sunday school and this and that, but I was uncomfortable. And I started to learn Judaism. I went to Jewish bookstores. I bought everything I could get my hands on, and I hid it under the bed. I was married. It was, I started, and difficult for me to admit, but I started going to services on Friday nights. And I was telling my ex-husband that I was going to ceramics classes. The problem is that at some point I had to produce ceramics, right? I mean, I just couldn't be going to ceramics classes and not produce a piece. So then I used to go sometimes after work in the afternoons and buy these horrendous pieces from the ladies that took them and brought them home as mine. So it was not an easy time. I can, let's say, banter a little bit with this, but I can't say it was hard. I was hiding what I was searching for. And at some point, my husband and I went our different ways. There was no way that I could keep up what I was doing and studying and learning, under the bed, there was so many books. So we went our separate ways. It was not really amicable. He had put in the divorce agreement that I could not convert my children, and couldn't take them to synagogue. And I didn't even know where or what I was doing at the time, except that I knew that I had to pursue Judaism. So from everything that I had read, I decided to take it slowly. I actually started for about a year at a Reconstructionist synagogue until I was maybe 26, until it was the first Rosh Hashanah. And we go to a big restaurant here, the whole synagogue in Miami, and they bring the plates, and it was shrimp. I didn't know much, but I knew we shouldn't be eating shrimp on Rosh Hashanah. So as much as I really loved the rabbi, he was very, I would say very Christian. It was the whole yada, yada, yada by the sea and this kind of thing. So I was kind of like attracted to it because I was afraid to take the leap, the guitar, the sea, the shrimp. I moved on. And then I went to a reform. And I stayed there for about a year and a half. And that was very hard for me, the reform movement. And again, I'm not talking in general about the world. I'm giving you my personal experience in my neighborhood in Miami. It was huge, and it was super cliquey. and nobody ever spoke to me. I spoke to the rabbi and he said, come whenever you want. It was super cliquey. And I sat in a corner for, I think, like, I don't know, a year maybe. And I thought, never met, really people were just ignoring me. Okay, fine. So then I moved on. And I started reading more and more and more and more. And I went to a little house that it was a young Israel, where I still go, by the way. And I walked in and it was a little shtibel. It was an old little house. The building hadn't been built. It was nothing. And I explained to the rabbi how I felt Jewish, how the Jewish had been tugging at me for years. And obviously, he pushed me away for I don't know how long. By now, I was 31. I mean, all of this took so long. We all know that, it's not so simple. And the fact that I had two kids that were not converting with me because I wanted to convert, not converting with me for the Orthodox, not to, I'm not Yiddish, but oh boy, I mean, seriously, what's happening here? So he persisted. No, I persisted and he listened, and I persisted and persisted. And finally I got to a Beit Din. For 5 years plus, I learned with this Beit Din. I went to this Beit Din who was discouraging me all along. I mean, from night to day. And I was learning with my rabbi. I was learning, serious. I mean, it was not only to read and write Hebrew, but the Shemirat Shabbat, like all the books, and, Taras Mishpaha, everything. And then the Beit Din wanted me to memorize the Shulchan Aruch, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. And I remember, and again, I was in a conversion process, but I would go to the beach with my son, who maybe now was 16, 17, and he would quiz me on it. So still today, he does not practice Judaism. My kids don't. I'll talk about my kids later. But my son teases me like, Mom, remember, you can't hold the cord of the dog's leash more than an inch from the neck. So, I mean, he remembers everything. He's got an elephant memory. So I went back to the Beit Din and I finally was able to convert. It was a huge monumental moment. By now, everyone I ever knew wasn't speaking to me, family included. This was very tough. My mom and dad and grandparents, they were all socialites, high echelon of the Cuban high society in Cuba and in Miami. And like we'd say, this was just a shanda. It wasn't because they're anti-Semitic, because they never were. It was because it was a shanda. You just don't have a kid who can no longer come to your house, no matter how old they are, and have dinner or come to a party and not eat anything. And, it was so hard for my mom. So hard. At the time, I tried to ease it up, but I couldn't. I mean, Orthodox is Orthodox, You can't be there Friday night. You can't participate in this. You can't participate in that. And I was single with two kids. Also not the best scenario. At synagogue, I remember I used to work with my dad. I was in the family pharmaceutical business for 45 years until I sold it a couple of years ago. My dad I worked with, we sat 2 feet apart from each other. And he would never have said this in front of Mom, but I used to go there and say, Dad, nobody talks to me. I said, what is wrong with me? Nobody talked to me over there. Nobody talks to me over here. I need to break into this community because this is what I've chosen. And I'm happy that I chose this, but nobody talks to me. So we started talking and he said, well, what do the women do after the prayers? And I said, well, everybody runs into the kitchen and prepares cakes on platters. He said, great. Next time all the women get up to prepare cakes on platters, you run into the kitchen and say, give me a cake to cut up. And that is how I was able to settle into Orthodoxy. And it's kind of a funny, but when you know how it works in a shul and you understand, and a small shul like we had, that, that Kiddush is going to come out and it's going to come out by the women. And, when you're schlepping potato chips back and forth, it kind of happens and it bonds. So I had friends that started inviting me for the holidays, and I was able to walk, and the rabbi included me a lot in his home. And then a bit after that, I met my husband, Michael, who was my competitor in the pharmaceutical business and lived in Belgium. And we started talking this and that, and we got married. Michael continued with his business in Belgium, but he came to live in Miami. So he was a great import. We didn't have to do much. Michael fit right in, and we started being very active in the shul and in the community. I was treasurer of the synagogue. We built a massive building, and my husband was teaching classes. He had lived in the States for many years. He had gone to Telz Yeshiva for years and years and years. And then he had gone to New York and he studied with Moshe Feinstein. So Michael is like in Perkei Avot. I chose a friend. I found a teacher. And Michael is my soulmate. And it wasn't easy for him as well. We really blended like twin souls. But Michael comes from the Rishner Rebbe. He's the 9th grandson of the Rishner Rebbe. So there was all of this Hasidic family that lives in Israel that had to accept me as well. So before we got married, Michael took me to Israel, and everybody living in Bnei Brak, and it was not easy. But my future mother-in-law at the time, she took me to meet the Behusha Rebbe, the Alta Behusha Rebbe. And if he gave his okay, I was okay. Shaking in my knees, right? So we're there, and he was a very small man, if anybody had ever met him, a very small man. And he was smiley and this and that. And at the end, he says something to her in Yiddish. And there was a lot of Hasidim there. And this was my mother-in-law's first cousin, because if you know about the Rishner Rebbe, they set up about 12 dynasties. So all of those are family. Basically. So when we left there, I said to her, what did he say? And he said to her, you're going to have a lot more nahis from this one than you did from the other one. So, this was Michael's second marriage as well. So the reality is that I settled in. Once the Behusha Rebbe gave his blessing, it was like a whole family, party, acceptance, hugs, everything. So, I was very lucky on that end. But my past people still didn't talk to me. Okay, I made a new family at Young Israel. A lot of people were Balei Teshuvas at the time. We became very tight, and life just kind of continued. So I had kind of thought sometimes that perhaps my family could have come from the Jews of Spain. But it was never my motivator. But as I learned a little bit more, I realized that I had asked my grandfather for a family tree. He never wanted to give it to me. But my grandmother and grandfather were first cousins. They had left me alone once in the house when I was about 14, and I dug out all the papers. And I saw that they had had a church dispensation for being first cousins. And I also saw a bit of a family tree and saw that their parents were first cousins. And I'm like, oh boy, that's weird. So one Friday morning, my grandmother dies, 7 a.m. And I'd been married to Michael a few years already. And I go to her house. They still hadn't taken it. And I said to my mom, I can't go tonight or tomorrow. It's Shabbat. I can't. Well, you better be there. I said, Mom, I cannot go. And she said, but your grandmother, I said, Mom, I understand, but I can't go. And I spoke to my rabbi, and he said, he gave me 1,000 ways for me to go. 1,000. And all of them included sleeping in the funeral home, right? And the burial was about 5 miles away. And so my mother, she said, in our family, we have to bury immediately. I said, Mom, you're Catholic, you're Cuban, bury her on Monday. What's going on? What do you mean you have to bury her within 18 hours? What is that all about? So the funeral happened without me. And on Shabbat, after shul, I was in my house, and my mom brought me a little box from my grandmother with a Hamsa and a Star of David earrings. And she said, your grandmother wanted me to give you this on the day of her death. And I fell back in my chair and I thought, my grandmother had been teaching me all throughout my lifetime the Jewish traditions in the kitchen. She taught me how to take dough and put it in aluminum foil and throw it in the back of the oven without a bracha. And she taught me how to check for vegetables until they were wilted. And she taught me how to always put an egg in a separate container and check for blood. In other words, that moment, all of these memories, plus the fact that my mother had to bury my grandmother in 18 hours. And I said, oh my gosh, they must be from the Jews of Spain. So is there anything you'd like to ask at this time?
I mean, there's so much to ask, but I was gonna ask you about the traditions. I think you mentioned in the book also the sweeping as well.
Yeah, the sweeping was an interesting tradition. So one of the traditions that my grandmother taught me was to sweep to the center of the room. And it's like, why are we sweeping to the center of the room? So, my husband is from Romania. He's Ashkenaz. At the beginning, Michael was a great, I'll use the word sport, because he supported me searching and looking, but the sweeping was a little too much for him. So we went to the first crypto-Jewish conference. There is such a thing in the West, and I was giving a talk. And Michael says to me, please don't mention the sweeping thing, that you sweep to the center of the room. And he said, promise me you won't. Okay. He said, it's just too much to handle that. You're going to say that crypto-Jews swept to the middle of the room. I said, okay. So we get there and they had like a Converso band from Mexico. And the first thing, the band leader, he was mariachi. They were all from the Mexican Inquisition descendants. First thing he says to a room of 400, raise your hand if you sweep to the center of the room. And I fell back in my chair laughing, and I raised both hands and I looked at it was the best I told you so moment of my life. But basically, so this was a very strong tradition. There was a mezuzah. There were no more mezuzahs. The Inquisition had us take the mezuzahs from the door post. So the women, to honor where the mezuzah had been, would not sweep trash out the door. So this stayed around the world, where we were taught to sweep to the center of the room and pick up the trash there. And even though nobody knows why, this is the one tradition that sticks out the most, really. Do you have any other questions before I continue?
No, continue on. I actually one more. I do want to ask you one. Because you mentioned crypto Jew and then Converso. I've asked a bunch of guests in this series, how do you use the terms interchangeably? Crypto Jew, Converso. People are familiar with Marrano. So how do you define and use these terms?
Marrano means pig. Any way you slice it, Marrano. And Marrano was not a term that the Christians were calling the Jews. I find it offensive. I mean, I find to be called a pig at any level is offensive. But the reason that I find it more offensive is that it was a term that was also used by the Jews to other Jews who converted really to Catholicism and weren't hiding. So the fact that the Christians were using it and the Jews were using it, initially it was the only term. People just say Marrano, but really it's Marrano, which means pig. So for me, it's a term that I won't use. And for Converso is a term that then became widely used. But a Converso is a convert, could be a convert to any religion, could be a convert from Judaism to Muslim. It does not specifically refer to a Jew. So I needed a term that B'nai Anusim, which is in Hebrew, outside of Israel, and nobody really knows it. So the term crypto Jew is the one that was coined in the Southwest. Hidden Jew, crypto hidden Jew. So we don't call ourselves crypto Jews, we call ourselves descendants of crypto Jews, just like B'nai Anusim. Anusim means forced. B'nai Anusim, children of the forced. So I use Crypto Jew, but when people are not enough into the topic, I will use Converso. And if they're really not into the topic, then I will say we used to be called Marranos, to just get people. So that's why you see so many disparities. And then there is the academic term, which is New Christian. Versus an old Christian. An old Christian was always Catholic. When the Inquisitions came, they remained Catholic and nothing to do. The new Christians were any Jew, Muslim, or whatever that had converted to Christianity, forced and continued to follow along, which brings me to something important because people always ask. Historians cannot decide, agree, let's use the term, whether there was 50,000 Jews or 1 million Jews before the Inquisition. So what is taken, pretty much everyone, what they take is there were 300,000. 100,000 left, as you know, to the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, etc., and they became the Sephardim that you know today. 100,000 stayed and assimilated and got lost completely. And 100,000 became hidden Jews. And it is from those 100,000 that I would descend. So there is that distinction with the amount of Jews at the time. So I will continue.
Yes, please.
Okay. So when I got the Hamsa and the Star of David earrings, I had a strong suspicion that I had been Jewish all along. However, I was very careful that it wasn't major wishful thinking. I had to be very careful because I had studied enough. I mean, with all the learning that I did with the Beit Din and my I had a PhD. I had to be very careful because I knew that whatever I found out, whatever I did, would affect my future generations. My children had already gotten older and older. I did not think that they would come over to the Jewish people, but because for me it was so important, not come to the Jewish people, I mean to the religion. Because it was so important to me, I decided to search until the end for this ancestry to see if it was real or it wasn't real. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence, the earrings, the this, the that, the cousins. So I started to search, and I knew in my heart, I knew that it would not change. It would not move the needle in my family. But I also I felt the need for myself to, was I crazy from the age of 6? So it was a double kind of who thinks about these things at the age of 6? You're playing hopscotch, you're playing jump rope. In my time, who's pondering the beyond? I mean, it's not happening. So I hired a genealogist in Spain. My grandfather had already died, maternal. My grandmother had just died, as I said. And then I asked her to give me anything she has. She was semi-talking to me. And she gave me a family tree that had been made by my grandfather. And I noticed immediately that every generation, first or second cousins. In genealogy, we call that a collapsed pedigree. Other people that don't have these cousins and cousins, their genealogy goes up like a tree. Mine would be sinking and sinking and sinking at every generation. And what that does, we'll talk about DNA at the end, but what that does is like what your car mirror says, it makes things appear closer than they are. So if you do a DNA test and you come from a family, and it's not just from Spain, a lot of the families from the States, they just married each other. So when it says this is your third cousin, if you have a lot of intermarriages, it could be your 15th cousin. It makes relationships appear closer than they are. So anyway, so I hired this fellow and I wanted him to research my lineage. I didn't just want to pay for this. I wanted this fellow to research my lineage fully. So he said he was wondering why I only wanted a maternal lineage. And he was an ex-priest or a deacon. He was high up in the Catholic Church. So I knew he didn't want to find this, right? And that's why I loved him, because he was like the devil's advocate. He didn't want to find it, and I wanted him to find it. So if he found it, it would be real. If that logic makes sense. So I told him I needed the maternal lineage, and he asked me, are you looking for, inheritance? And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. Are you looking for royalty? Oh, 100%. And he said, you're looking for a Jewish maternal lineage, aren't you? And I was in Miami and he was in Madrid. So I paid him. He pretty much, with the family tree, my grandfather had taken it back to like 1765. I asked him for every single piece of paper, birth certificate, marriage certificate, death certificate. I had never done this before. No one had ever done this before. And I was going to be the first one, but I had years of experience with the Bet Din to know what I was going to eventually have to come up with. So he found me every single document. He put me together with 15 grandmothers in 1545 until I started finding some circumstantial evidence. For example, a lot of the baptism certificates, the babies were never baptized, and because they were going to die, nobody died. So many generations of babies in my family were never baptized. And I had a lot of circumstantial evidence like that. There was a lot of nuns and priests in the family, and it's known in crypto-Jewish families that there's always priests to make sure that the Jewish rituals are kept, like you would get married Jewishly the night before your Catholic wedding. So there was just a lot of circumstantial evidence, and I packed everything up. I was really excited, and I went to Israel, and I met with a Dayan. And I met with one rabbi, believe it, I didn't meet, my husband did, because he only spoke Yiddish, with Rabbi Karelitz, who had just said that in Mallorca, everybody from there didn't have to convert. They were already Jewish. And my husband showed my tree, and he went, I was there, and his son, but all in Yiddish. And he said, I think that he did it for Mallorca with like a big paintbrush, but he wasn't willing to have onesies and come to him. So he said, look, your wife is halachically Jewish. We can't make her more Jewish. We can't make salt into salt. So I can't do anything. So then I went to the Dayan. He looked at all my papers, and he was like, wow, this is an amazing feat of genealogy. I've never seen anything like this in my life. It's He said, however, you didn't show me the Jew in the tree. So what do you mean the Jew in the tree? He said, yes, you have references to an Inquisition, and you have references to this. He said, I need you to go back, go to that village where your family lived. Fermoselle is Spain, which is on the border of Spain and Portugal. Your family lived there for 600 years. Find me evidence that Jews live there. And then find me someone direct on your maternal lineage that was killed in the Inquisition. I was so disappointed. I was already 8 years into it, 8, 9 years maybe into it. Not just 8, 9 years. Let me pick this up twice a year. No, 8 to 9 years where this guy was looking and hunting and searching and taking things out. And then I was looking at every paper, and I was analyzing and looking up customs and learning. And I left there, and my husband said to me, eventually we're going to have to go to the village. And I said, I can't handle it. What if I'm wrong? What if I have been wrong all these years? I mean, I was in tears. It was difficult. And he said, if you're wrong, you were wrong. And we live a very active Jewish life. Now we've been married 10 years at the time, or 12. You live a very active Jewish life. You're very, in the community. He said, but you have to get to the bottom of this. We've come too far. So I packed up my family tree, which by now had maybe 8,000, 9,000 people on it. My husband bought tickets, and off we go to this little village. And I'm walking through the village asking about Jews, and they're telling me there was never any Jews there. There was never, they never lived here. We had Visigoths, and we had Celts, and we had this, and troglodytes, but there were never any Jews. And I'm like, oh. Only about 200 people still live there. My grandfather had been born there, and every generation of grandparents had been born there. My mom even lived there for a couple of years. Tiny little village, tiny. So it wasn't like there was that many people to talk to. At the time, the mayor wouldn't talk to me, but they did tell me that the historian was the keeper of the church. So I go to the door of the church, And she happened to have a double last name like my grandfather, Ramo. And no, there were never any Jews here. And I was carrying the family tree, and she said, "What's a family name?" And every single Hispanic name known to man was on that list. And I kept going, Alvarez and Gonzalez and Martinez. And, my dad's name, by the way, my maiden name is Medina, as in Medina. And my other name is Ramos. So I kept going down the list, and I was unfurling the tree in front of the church. And she said, no, no. And she kept insisting. I thought she was nuts. She kept insisting, what is the family name? And I remember that my grandfather, in a spidery little handwriting, had written on the corner of the family tree, they called us bollicos in Spanish. No decían los bollicos, which I since learned that bollico in Ladino means little bread. And I said, they called us bollicos. She said, you're from the Bollico family? And I'm like, well, I guess. I never, and I said, yes. And she said, I'll take you to see the synagogue tomorrow. And what I wanted to do was take my 8,000 people family tree and hit her over the head, because, come on, I'm up to 2 hours earlier, there was no Jew, there was no synagogue. So the next day we go to a synagogue that she says a home. Was the original arch. These pictures are on my website, I believe. So it was the original arch of the synagogue. And we go inside. The lady let us inside, and there was nothing. She had redone it. And this historian tells me that there was an oral story that the rabbi lived on top and the services were at the bottom. I saw no evidence of it at all. And I was getting hysterically desperate, because I knew what it was to face the Dayan again in Israel. I had no other hope, no other way to go. This was it. And as we're walking out, there was a little closed door in the foyer. And I said, can I go in there? She said, no, I've never redone that. She was about in her 80s. And I said, well, what's there? And she said, we've never redone it. It's the garage. And I started opening the door. She's telling me not to. And I'm thinking of the ugly American, right? Pushy, how we're seen sometimes overseas. But honestly, I didn't have a choice, because if I walked out of that house, which was the only shred of anything that I had been told was Jewish. So I walk in and I said, please. And I'm walking backwards, and I'm like semi-bowing and apologizing the whole time. And Michael is like right next to me, and he's like, he's doing the, oh boy, kind of thing, and I see a baby gate in a hole on the floor. And I said, can I look in there? And she said, no, please. I felt so bad. That's where I keep my ham and my wines. And I said, please, 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 as I'm undoing the baby gate. And I see that there's, she turns on the light, and I begged. I was begging. I see 7 steps, and I walk down. Michael walks behind me, and it was a rectangular, huge rectangular room with 7 steps and a big water spout at the end with water coming in. And I said, oh my gosh, I'm in the mikvah. I'm standing in the mikvah. I apologized profusely again. I took 100 pictures and I left. And then I found a younger historian. She had no idea what a Jew was, what anything was, but she said, show me what you're looking for. So I pull out my iPhone and I'm looking. I showed her the menorah. I showed her Hebrew letters. I showed other candelabras. I don't think I would have, maybe I showed her a Star of David, but historically that came later. So basically she's running around, and I explained about mikvot, and she took me to a place in the center of town, and she said, I think this is the bath that you're looking for. So there was one in the rabbis and another one, and it opens up, and it had 7 steps, old as can be, with crystalline water inside it. Fresh spring water. I took pictures all over town, symbols, blah, 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 anything you could imagine. And I came home and I sent the pictures all over the world. Any university that had Inquisition studies. And it was from Oxford to Notre Dame to Bar Ilan, archaeologists, biblical archaeology, you name it, they got the pictures. Nobody answered. Nobody. Trying to see if I had enough proof that it was, in fact, a Jewish place. Nothing, except one archaeologist who lives in the north of the Galil, and he had been a tour guide in Portugal for many years. And he wrote back to me and he said, all that symbology that's on the walls, you have to take a picture with a sun of 2:00. Because at 2:00, the messages emerge from the rocks. And that's how the crypto Jews did it. You can only read them at 2:00. And I had promised Michael we would never go back to Fermoselle because it's a godforsaken little town. You can't even imagine how difficult it is. No, you can't imagine. You can all imagine how difficult it is for us to be in these places with the food situation. You know, like how much salami can you take in your cans of tuna? It's not easy. So he promised me that we wouldn't go back. And I did. And we went back. And this time I brought with me historians, and I brought with me video cameras, and I brought with me, I mean, everything you can imagine, because I needed this done. And as we are driving there, it's 4.5 hours west from Madrid. Like right when you're going to reach the natural border between Spain and Portugal, you fall into Fermoselle, this town. So driving the second time, I started to see that Portugal was so much more visible than Spain was. Very barren, very arid. It looks sometimes a little bit like when you're driving down in the Negev and there's still a little bit of grass and, you know, it's still a little bit, you know, sandy. And it was almost that kind of feeling. And then as I saw it for like the third time, I said, oh my gosh, my family was not in the Inquisition of Spain. It must have been Portugal, right across the river. So anyway, so we went into the town. I'll get back to that. We went into the town and they were taking pictures and we were looking at the images. With the sun of 2:00, you could see a menorah that had the words Yud Hey Vav Hey on the top, was one of the inscriptions. And I was able to find things all around. The historian said that the first mikvah was a mikvah, the second mikvah was a mikvah. And then in the hostel, because there's no hotels, I put on the computer and I found in the Inquisition records of Portugal 45 relatives directly on my maternal line that had been burnt alive at the Inquisition as martyrs. And that was creepy, to say the least, but I understood that the drive, what had been in me, what had followed me all of these years was just, you know, all of these relatives. So I put everything together. I had all those Inquisition records read and translated. I took everything to Israel. I went back, I sat in front of him again. But come on, by tenacity alone, they should have known I was a Jew. Seriously, who does this? I mean, and because I was the first, and I devised a way to get back to the Jewish, with no cemeteries, with no ketubot, with no Brit Milah documents, just going back through Catholic records. Luckily, in 1545, the Catholic records end, and it's state records, which are the notarial and protocol documents, and then it's church records again with the Inquisition, but kind of state and church, because as we know, we cannot just use documents from another religion as a witness. So I was very lucky that a lot of, you know, halachically, so I was very lucky that a lot of these documents were federal or government documents as well. So they translated everything in Israel into Hebrew, and they gave me a document that states that I was born Jewish and all my ascendants were Jewish and all my descendants were Jewish. And when the rabbi gave it to me, he said, this document, I'm buying you 2 years. If you don't resolve this mess in your family within 2 years, he said, your great grandkids are going to go into that room and where you have all of this paperwork, and they are going to throw it away. And all of this work will be for naught. And he's right. And I decided at that moment to dedicate my life and my mission to help other people return. My family knows our ancestry. My kids, when my son, he lives in Washington, when he had his daughter, he put her in the JCC school until because he really feels he's not a practicing Catholic. And when they ask him what religion he generally will answer, and I think he made this up, but it sounds good, ancestrally Jewish. So my granddaughter was at the JCC until she was maybe 3 or 4, lighting menorahs, saying the brahas. I couldn't be a prouder grandma. But then comes Pesach, and she comes home and she says, you guys are eating bread. You can't eat bread. You have to eat matzah. And I did say to him, I said, put her in a secular school. You don't want to mess her up completely. She may pick this up later. But the fact that you guys don't go to any kind of a synagogue, you don't do, anything, and you've got your daughter, it's not sustainable. What you're doing is not sustainable. So my other daughter had a baby 2 years ago. My other daughter also believes they're not religious at all. She identifies as Catholic with Jewish ancestry. But what was most impactful for me was, as I said before, my relationship with mom, obviously mom was Jewish. And sometime in 2014, she asked to see my rabbi, and my husband took her. And she told my rabbi that she did not want to die Catholic. She wanted to die Jewish, and she wanted to return. So by the terms of the document that had been given to me, she had to do one mitzvah. And it was a Friday, and he said, go home and light candles with your mom. And we got to her house. I felt like some sort of Twilight Zone episode, I was on a different planet. And mom said the bracha. She said, say it to me in English. She went like this. She lit candles. And I'm like, oh, what just happened? As I drove home. That Sunday morning, my dad called me that mom, mentally she was gone. Motzei Shabbos had been very late that night. Motzei Shabbos had been late. It's over late. So it was like 9 something and middle of summer. And I didn't call mom. I thought I'll call her Sunday morning and, find out how does she feel? What's going on? And she was gone that month into deep Alzheimer. She stayed that way until she died last year. I never spoke to mom about it. I could never speak to mom about it. But it was the last act that she did. So she knew. She knew. I can't believe that, society would have such a huge impact on her. But, that's who she was. She was just a society, but she returned, which is just incredible. And I have dedicated my life for the last 7 or 8 years, number one, to digitizing all the Inquisition documents in the world. I have funding out of Israel. I have so far only succeeded in one. I have huge resistance. I have had to go to the Pope to ask for help. He has assigned clergy in the Vatican to help me. We're talking, all I need him is to, wave his magic wand and tell people, do it. But there's Inquisition documents that are in Mexico, Lima, Peru, Cartagena, Colombia, Portugal. We're almost finished digitizing. We did get a contract signed, and Spain is like hitting your head on a brick wall. So I have also made it my mission to work with organizations that work with emerging communities. Many times you will find me in El Salvador, making tortillas, teaching kashrut. Michael and I have built 2 or 3 mikvot in the emerging communities of Latin America. As they return slowly, we help them. Michael teaches, I teach. And right now, we are so involved in this. I'm super active on social media, in my YouTube channel. I have classes, I have talks. I have, during the pandemic, I gave classes every Tuesday night in Spanish on kashrut. During the pandemic, I became a mashgiach with a KOA so that I could teach better industrially when, of course, I know kashrut, but not industrial kashrut. So I became a mashgiach to be able to teach industrial kashrut. And that's what we dedicate our lives to now: teaching, doing, elevating, and helping people that want to return to return.
So have you helped others return, actually? Were others
I
Megayer?
would say that it's pretty much, I don't count, but it's in the thousands.
Wow, amazing. Now, did you mention, you mentioned earlier you were going to talk about DNA. Did you talk about the DNA?
So DNA, we don't really obviously take DNA, let's say as a halacha. There's still a lot to be, there's still a lot of gaps, I would say. I would love it if we could. My DNA is Ashkenaz. I don't know where that came from because I own every single piece of paper. But I ended up researching 28 lines. I'm sorry, there's 32 lines that come from our great grandparents. We all have 32 lines. The mother, I researched in detail 28 lines in the last 20 years. I have 28 lines that lead back to Jews killed in the Inquisitions of Cadiz, Spain, Canary Islands, Cartagena, Colombia. I have so much of my dad's family and so much of my mom's family perished in the Inquisition around the world. So my dad used to tell me all the time, you keep looking for mom. He said, I'm more Jewish than she is. And he was a real trooper. But yes, my dad descends from an incredible lineage from Córdoba, Spain. There was what today is called the House of the Jews, La Casa de la Judería. It's a palace. Juan Sigler de Espinosa, on my dad's side, owned it, and he was my 17th grandfather. My great-grandmother was Sigler de Espinosa. So mom's lineage is long and rich, and dad's lineage, imagine 28 lines, hundreds and thousands and thousands of people, and they were all married to each other. So I went to a geneticist about the DNA, and I said, look, everybody's married to each other. And I said, what does that say about me? He said, you're either crazy or you're intense about your passions. So the DNA, doesn't always work out the same. But for example, my kids have 52%. My mom has 48%, a mixture of Ashkenaz and Sephardic. My dad, for whatever reason, even though they're from Spain, is all Ashkenaz. So seeing my own, I understand that it's not an exact science.
Wow. Okay. So you mentioned your website, your YouTube channel. I'll link that in the show's notes. But I want to mention your books because I read your books, which are My 15 Grandmothers, which is, a lot of what you said here, a lot of your story. Pyre to Fire, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's this historical fiction.
Right. Pyre to Fire is an interesting book because after I searched for my grandmothers, I had so much archival material that's here in my house in boxes, and notary records that said who they were and where they lived and how they moved and where they went. So I wrote Pyre to Fire, and that's from the burning pyre where they were burned alive to the fire in the soul that remained all of these years, because these returns are about the neshama, 100%. So then I wrote how I found my 15 grandmothers in English and Spanish. And then at one point in mom's house, after she passed, she said she had nothing Jewish. And I respected that when we put her in a memory care place, and I didn't enter her house. I didn't want to find this. I didn't want to search where she didn't want to be searched. I wanted to respect that. So at that point, I went into her kitchen, and in a bottom drawer of her kitchen were recipes written by the grandmothers for centuries. And there were several Inquisition recipes. And if you look, there was one called pork chops that was pretending to be a pork chop, but it was really French toast. And if anybody follows Jamie Geller, I've actually made with Jamie Geller, we made the recipe pork chop. So there were Inquisition recipes. And then in Israel, I published the recipes of my 15 grandmothers. All of these books are also published in Spanish. And I have been trying to work on a new book, but instead I have been very lucky that since last year, there were 2 documentaries that are being made about my life. One was already finished in Israel, and that's in Hebrew with English subtitles. But the other one, I'm leaving for Spain and Portugal right after Purim. And that one, we will be filming the footsteps of the book Fire to Fire in the archives, where my family lived, where they went from place to place. And the film crew already filmed in Cuba. We've shot a lot already in Miami. There have been very important interviews in New York next week. We're interviewing Professor Ronnie Perellis, who is a maven on this topic, and he is a professor at Yeshiva University. So there's historians, there's people, there's testimony, and I'm looking forward to seeing it in the film festival next year.
Okay, so and you said the Hebrew one is already. I can link to that in the show's notes.
I have to get you the link. I'm not sure they premiered it yet. I think they're waiting for me, but I'm kind of busy on this side of the world.
So if it's available before, because this won't air, for a bit still, as part of the towards the end of the series. Now that the series is kind of culminating with, we want, as you mentioned right at the beginning, kind of crypto Jews, with ancestry returning. So. But if it's available, you'll send me the link and I'll put it in the show.
By the way, on my YouTube channel, there is an 11-minute documentary that was already made that you may want to hook up to if we don't get to that.
Okay, so I'll make a note of that as well. So listen, it's really a fascinating story, and thank you for sharing it.
Thank you.
And the listeners, again, the book is, I told you, I read both my 15 Grandmothers and Fire to Fire.
It's a Shabbos read.
I read it over Shabbos. It's very enjoyable. It's a light read. It's a fascinating story. It reads quickly. They're both, I think my 15 Grandmothers is like 150 pages or so. The other one's about 200 pages.
Yeah, it's a light read.
Not a small font. It reads pretty quick. So I'll link to those, and people can check.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for joining me.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.